Hey everyone, this is a piece by Hillel Ticktin. It's titled Leon Trotsky's Political Economic Analysis of the USSR, 1929 to 40. Trotsky's method. Trotsky's approach to the USSR was complex. In The Revolution Betrayed, it was more journalistic and impressionistic than in his Political Economy of Capitalism or in his History of Russia. He also showed, however, a profundity in his understanding of the forces at work in Soviet society, particularly in his speech on the, quote, scissors crisis, end quote, at the 12th Congress of the Russian Communist Party in 1923, which remains unmatched. In between, his many articles on the Soviet Union have provided the theoretical basis for practically every serious Marxist analysis of the Soviet Union. Footnote. I am excluding here Maoist views as they lack any real basis other than support of Mao himself. Maoists either repeated a new class viewpoint which had already been formulated by Trotskyist proponents of state capitalism and bureaucratic collectivism, or else produced an obscurantism which was not only un-Marxist but lacked any genuine meaning. Anarchists and anarcho-Marxists in their turn sometimes derive their theory from Trotskyism, as with Castoriadis, but more often produced a series of anti-state pronouncements which did little to further our understanding of the Soviet Union. Above all, most of the analyses of the Soviet Union have been bedeviled by a total failure to grasp its empirical reality and to marry it with an evolution of Marxist concepts. While this is true both of theories that were derived from those of Trotsky and those which were not, it is only the former that have shown any kind of potential for development. For a complete account of all known theories, see Marcel van der Linden's Western Marxism in the Soviet Union. End footnote. It is impossible to produce a consistent theory of a rapidly changing entity. Trotsky captured the essence of the movement of the Soviet Union, but he failed to produce a theory of its nature. His writings are necessarily inconsistent. The basis of his argument is that a new social group had arisen and expropriated the proletariat, but because it had not overthrown nationalized property, this new social group was centrist in that it stood between capitalism and revolution. Trotsky failed to recognize the specificity of Stalinism. To call a social group, quote, centrist, end quote, gives it an importance and value above that of capitalism. Yet this same social group was responsible for acts of barbarism which exceeded those of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. Trotsky recognized this point when he declared that Stalinism was politically worse than fascism. The problem was that he still seemed to hold to the view that nationalized property somehow made the Soviet elite superior. In fact, Trotsky's violent attacks on the ruling Soviet elite belie that viewpoint. The only conclusion that could be drawn was that Trotsky saw the overthrow of private property in the Russian Revolution as a crucial phenomenon which determined all future history. In a certain sense, however, the overthrow of private property, once performed, becomes irreversible. Although the particular nationalized property itself could revert to private ownership, large-scale nationalization of property demonstrated that capitalism was transient. It could be overthrown, and that an alternative was therefore feasible. One can then argue that nationalized property is part of the epoch as a whole, and not just a feature of the USSR, as Trotsky also seemed to be arguing. The Soviet elite thus reveals itself to be reactionary and to have no special role in the future. Footnote. Trotsky spoke of the possibility of the bureaucracy privatizing the nationalized concerns, but he did not appear to think that it would be successful in the endeavor it would be successful in that endeavor in the 1920s. Quote, if Messrs. Capitalists hope that capitalism will be reborn again in our country, they will be disappointed. For the resurrection of capitalism in our country, they would have to wait until the second coming of Christ. End quote. Leon Trotsky, Speech in Honor of the Communist International, the first 5 years of the Communist International. Volume 2, 1953. This was in 1922. I have cited this instance in the next chapter in this book, in which I discuss the issue in more detail. End footnote. The laws of the political economy of the USSR during the 1920s were explained by Preobrazhensky, who emphasized the conflict between planning and the market. In fact, the concept of two conflicting laws operating under the new economic policy was derived from Trotsky's view of the forces of socialism fighting the forces of capitalism within the context of the new economic policy as expressed in the interaction of plan and market. Nonetheless, Trotsky did not produce a theory that was based on his perceptions, and Preobrazhensky did. In so doing, the strengths and weaknesses of these two people become apparent. Preobrazhensky was the most profound and courageous political economist of the Bolshevik Party and the left opposition. But Preobrazhensky lacked both the subtlety of Trotsky and the historical understanding and the dialectical skill necessary to be a great political economist. Trotsky, on the other hand, was probably the most dialectical of all Marxist writers since Marx, but his work never delved sufficiently deeply into political economy itself. As a result, Trotsky's method was profound, but was unable to reach the fundamental laws in operation. The result was that both Trotsky and Preobrazhensky failed to grasp the full nature of Stalinism. They saw Stalin as a centrist standing between capitalist restoration in the person of Bukharin and the proletarian revolution as expressed by the left opposition. To call Stalin and the bureaucratic elite, quote, centrist, end quote, is simply meaningless today. The Stalinist road was a path of its own, and it is this specificity and historical role which Trotsky did not understand. Because he could not recognize the special historical role of Stalinism, Trotsky attributed to Stalinism a specifically political nature. This in turn meant that he saw Stalinism as a phenomenon which was largely subjective. On the other hand, Trotsky's work is full of insights, impressions, and profound categorizations of the movement of Soviet reality. When Trotsky characterized Stalinism as worse politically than fascism, it was an insight which was as profound as any. Only now are we beginning to see the depths of the brutality of Stalinism, and it is clear that it was indeed worse than Hitlerite Germany. But Trotsky's characterization was a political one, not a social and economic one. Sorry, there's some footnotes that I missed. Footnote 1. The theoretical problem is that the two laws of which Preobrazhensky spoke did indeed interpenetrate and contradict each other, so providing two poles of a new entity. Logically, planning and the market stand in conflict, with one necessarily squeezing out the other. Hence, Preobrazhensky provided the dynamic of a genuine transition period, and not of Stalinism. I argue this point in the chapter Trotsky and the Social Forces Leading to Bureaucracy. End footnote. Next footnote. It must be emphasized that to say that Stalinism was a path of its own does not mean that Stalinism was a mode of production, but only that Stalinism established a temporary system which had its own life and laws. End footnote. There are three reasons why Trotsky's understanding of the USSR was relatively limited. Firstly, he could not have been aware of the changes occurring in the USSR at the time, when all knowledge was so heavily controlled. Secondly, events themselves were moving so fast that the USSR appeared to be unformed. That is really what Trotsky was saying, and yet the nature of the USSR was to be unformed. To have understood that a society could have come into being, yet at the same time was never truly formed, that is to say, never established itself as a mode of production, and so swallowed up its own population in the process, was possibly superhuman. Footnote. How are we to understand a statement like the following, quote, industry, freed from the material control of the producer, took on a super-social, that is, bureaucratic character, end quote. Trotsky, The Degeneration of Theory and the Theory of Degeneration, from the writings of Leon Trotsky, 1932-33. A super-social character implies that the bureaucratic form of which he spoke is really undefined. Otherwise, he could just say that it takes on a new form. End footnote. Thirdly, Trotsky's greatness derived from his position in the political economic process. Once cast aside in exile, Trotsky became a mortal like all other mortals, and the lack of people with whom to discuss and interact could only cause his thought to decline. That does not mean, of course, that his thought was not profound in his last years, but only that it was below his previous level. Trotsky's problem. The overall outline of the USSR was already clear in theoretical terms by 1929. A new bureaucratic social group had taken power. It was attempting to establish its own system of control. A number of questions then arose. Where did this new group come from? What was the objective basis of this bureaucratic elite in Soviet society? What were the laws of the operation of Soviet society? And what was its nature? The answer to the last question provided the basis for the determination of the longevity of the regime. There was a necessary corollary to the replies. The nature of the epoch would be determined by the answer to these questions. Trotsky in particular used the concept of the epoch. Footnote. Quote, but there still remains the character of the Soviet state, which does not remain at all unchangeable throughout the whole transitional epoch, end quote. End footnote. Trotsky argued that the Social Democrats had rescued the bourgeoisie, and so the period, quote, stretched out to a whole historical epoch, end quote. Trotsky's answer to these questions, however, was not clear. He appeared to regard the bureaucracy as a subjective phenomenon born of objective circumstances. Quote, the historical crisis of mankind is reduced to the crisis of the revolutionary leadership, end quote. Trotsky, The Transitional Program. The problem, of course, is that the subjective/objective dialectic has to be formulated, but it was extremely difficult to do so. The reason, in principle, lies in the fact that the epoch itself was one of transition, as Trotsky correctly saw it. A transitional epoch from capitalism to socialism could only mean that there was a movement from the objective occurrence of events towards the socialist form of planning. In the intermediate period, organization and administration of the economy and political life were bound to come to the fore. Hence, the subjective would play an increasing role in political life. But what role? Since there was neither planning nor the pristine spontaneous market, it was not at all clear. In fact, without theorizing it, Trotsky placed a stress on both aspects. He had, however, posed the question of the emergence of the bureaucracy and had attempted to answer it. His answer was twofold. On the one hand, the bureaucracy was the organ of the world bourgeoisie, or, in other words, the expression of the victory of the world bourgeoisie within the USSR. Footnote, quote, Stalin serves the bureaucracy and thus the world bourgeoisie, end quote. Trotsky, not a workers' and not a bourgeois state, question mark. Writings of Leon Trotsky, 1937-38, end footnote. On the other hand, it was also the immediate expression of the interests of the apparatus which had come into being under conditions of both scarcity and the market. It is, of course, obvious that the combination of relatively well-paid non-Marxist specialists and party and state officials who were appearing in positions of privilege and authority, even if they were not corrupt, represented a conservative force. Trotsky, therefore, did see the bureaucracy as an objective phenomenon. Quote, the Soviet bureaucracy, which represents an amalgam of the upper stratum of the victorious proletariat with broad strata of the overthrown classes, includes within itself a mighty agency of world capital, end quote. Trotsky, Problems of the Development of the USSR, Writings of Leon Trotsky, 1930-31. If carried through, this view ought to have led him to continue his analysis on an objective plane. A new stage in the discussion was reached with Christian Rakovsky's intervention in the debate. Trotsky considered that Rakovsky's letter to Valentinov of the 2nd of August 1928 was, quote, exceptionally interesting and significant, end quote, and it logically led to an analysis of the bureaucracy in terms of the market itself. Footnote, Christian Rakovsky, the, quote, professional dangers, end quote, of power. Selected Writings on Opposition in the USSR, 1923-30. Isaac Deutscher refers to the way in which Trotsky commended Rakovsky's work to others in the second volume of his trilogy, The Prophet Unarmed. Deutscher sees Rakovsky's work as both more pessimistic than Trotsky and also more sociological. Deutscher argues that Rakovsky saw the division in the working class as inevitable in any country or period. Gus Fagan, in his introduction to the Rakovsky collection, follows Deutscher. Both Deutscher and Fagan's interpretations are tendentious. Rakovsky was certainly more incisive than Trotsky and possibly less optimistic, but there is no evidence that he had become so much a liberal that he now argued that power automatically and inevitably corrupts, to the point where socialism could be prevented through the inevitable rise of a bureaucracy. End footnote. Rakovsky had analyzed the bureaucracy in a way which was novel for its time. Rakovsky argued that it was a new social group. His argument was twofold. On the one hand, Rakovsky pointed out that it was in an analysis, which Trotsky specifically called superstructural, that the taking of power automatically put the section of the workers who ruled in a privileged position. He talked of both material privilege and the corruption of power in itself. Footnote. No footnote. Never mind. Rakovsky then stressed the importance of educating the working class, but Rakovsky also specifically spoke of its corruption by the nobility and the market. For Rakovsky, this degeneration of the working class could be mitigated through the correct leadership of the Communist Party, which, of course, was not forthcoming at that time. Furthermore, he specifically argued that, quote, we should have been prepared for the nefarious influence of the NEP against the temptations and ideology of the bourgeoisie, end quote. Rakovsky. At that time, the question of the source of the degeneration was less necessary, since it was obvious that if the bureaucracy was the organ of the world bourgeoisie, it arose from the market. Footnote. Trotsky said, quote, in that period, bracket, that is, under Lenin, end bracket, bureaucratic deformation represented the direct inheritance of the bourgeois regime and, in that sense, appeared as a mere survival of the past, end quote. Trotsky then went on to say that the, quote, bureaucracy received new sources of nourishment, end quote. Trotsky, not a workers' and not a bourgeois state. End footnote. Today, however, such a question is clearly posed. Even if Trotsky's view was clear, it has never been spelled out. What is needed is a discussion of the interaction between the new economic policy and the origins of the bureaucratic elite. Trotsky did make it clear that the bureaucratic apparatus merged with the, quote, bourgeois elements, end quote. Footnote. Quote, the capitalist element finds its primary expression in the class differentiation in the countryside and in the increased numbers of private traders. The upper layers in the countryside and the bourgeois elements in the city are interweaving themselves more and more closely with various components of our government and economic apparatus, end quote. Trotsky, Platform of the Opposition. End footnote. The next question is, why did they not introduce the market at the time? Trotsky did reply that they would have liked to, but they were unable to do it. Footnote. Trotsky, where is the Soviet Republic going? Trotsky argued that there was a battle between the petite bourgeois elements and Stalin, but also, quote, this conservative layer, which constitutes Stalin's most powerful support in his struggle against the opposition, is inclined to go much further to the right in the direction of the new property elements than Stalin himself or the main nucleus of his faction, end quote. Trotsky. End footnote. Wait, hold on. Nope, not the end of the footnote. By the term, quote, conservative layer, end quote, Trotsky was referring to the, quote, majority of this officialdom, end quote. From this point of view, there were two political forces which wanted the restoration of private property. Those who held private property, that is to say, the property-owning peasantry and the netmen, and large sections of the bureaucratic apparatus itself. Stalin did not choose that path. The same general attitude is taken in Trotsky's, quote, preface to Les Révolutions des Figures. End footnote. What were the conditions at that time which constrained the bureaucracy from introducing the market? Trotsky's critique. Trotsky's critique was composed of a number of elements: labor, the gains of the October Revolution, and planning, which are discussed in turn below. The result is quite complex. Labor. Trotsky argued that the framework of the USSR remained nationalized property. This gave those who controlled the bureaucratic apparatus enormous strength based on their ability to direct labor in the economy. This insight has unfortunately been largely lost sight of outside of critique. critique being the journal that Ticktin ran and I believe continues to run. The stress on the control of an amorphous labor force goes straight to the heart of the matter, both methodologically and theoretically. Methodologically, this argument goes back to Marxist political economy and its starting point in human social labor and the specific form of that labor. Trotsky was implicitly arguing that human social labor in the USSR was not independently oriented, but was controlled, and hence the regime had enormous economic and social power. What Trotsky could not foresee was that the contradictions involved in such control would lead to the purges, labor camps, and a grossly inefficient economy. Trotsky could see the advantages in terms of growth and the disadvantages of the lack of democracy in terms of waste, but Trotsky did not foresee the scale of the killing and enormity of the waste. Footnote. Trotsky said that, quote, bureaucratism as a system became the worst brake on the technical and cultural development of the country, end quote. Trotsky, end footnote. The fundamental problem was that Trotsky anticipated the rapid end of the bureaucracy, and so he had no need to produce a theory of the nature of its economy. The question of the contradictions of the system is taken up below. In methodological terms, the problem is that labor is obliged to have a form. Under capitalism, it is abstract labor. Under socialism, it is directly social labor. Under feudalism, it is subsistence labor combined with a direct extraction of the surplus product, etc. What was it under Stalinism? Implicitly, I have already answered the question. It is the form of no form. Put differently, the question is one of the extraction of the surplus product and the form under which it took place. It was clearly unique, as it was neither capitalist nor socialist. In fact, as I have argued elsewhere, it was because the extraction of the surplus product conflicted with the control over the labor process that the system malfunctioned, was inefficient, and gave rise to massive waste. Yet this is no more than a statement that there was no historical form of social labor, but a stalemate between the social groups in the USSR and a historical stalemate between the classes in the world. Trotsky, of course, insisted on the crucial role of labor productivity. He pointed out time and again that as long as productivity was lower than the rest of the world, the USSR would remain unstable. Trotsky's strength lay in his statements that the nature of the USSR was undetermined, and in his perception that it was the centralized control over labor which permitted the bureaucracy to rule. He specifically argued that, quote, the control of the surplus product opened the bureaucracy's road to power, end quote. Trotsky's weakness lay in his inability to theorize these points to their logical conclusion. The gains of the October Revolution. Instead, misled by optimism and poor information, Trotsky still placed hopes on the preservation of aspects of the October Revolution. This led him to produce his formulation of the conflict in the USSR between the, quote, social revolution, end quote, still existing, quote, in property relations, end quote, on the one hand, and bourgeois norms of distribution on the other. That such a conflict existed in the early days of the USSR was obvious, but that a bureaucratic apparatus would necessarily appropriate as much control as possible to itself over the means of production did not seem to enter Trotsky's discussion. In order to appropriate the surplus product, the bureaucracy had to assert control over the means of production and thus over labor and its product. But once that is said, there is no longer a conflict between production and distribution. Of course, If one argues that the working class in some sense remained in power, and the elite was confined by the structure itself, then Trotsky would have been right. This, of course, is what he did argue. Quote, "Thus, in spite of monstrous bureaucratic distortions, the class basis of the USSR remains proletarian," end quote. Trotsky, in Stalin, pages 405 to 6. Footnote. In similar vein, quote, "In general and on the whole, the new economic base is preserved in the USSR, though in a degenerated form," end quote. Trotsky, The World Situation and Perspectives. End footnote. The problem is that no elite would accept such structural control. It would inevitably try to find ways of removing it. Indeed, Trotsky goes into some detail on precisely this point. The whole essence of the discussion since the 1930s has really been around this question of the nature of the structural control and the form in which the elite managed to liberate itself from the original form of the nationalized property. From one angle, such a division between production and appropriation is a nonsense, but looked at historically, it has its own justification. If the working class were in power but could not run its own economy because it had neither the skills nor the experience, it would have to delegate authority to a bureaucratic apparatus. This, it could be argued, was the case in the 1920s, and this is precisely what Trotsky did argue, starting from the general principle that any transitional period involved a bourgeois state enforcing bourgeois norms of distribution on socialist property relations. The problem, however, is to argue that the working class was still in power in however attenuated a sense in the 1930s. Nationalization is not good enough as an argument. Here, Trotsky's political view of Stalinism as centrism is crucial. If Stalin actually stood between the revolutionary left and the capitalist restoration that he still embodied, in however distorted a form, the spirit of the October Revolution. If, on the other hand, Stalin represented a systematic if temporary change in control, which completely dispossessed the working class, then it could not be said that there was a difference between the form of control over the means of production and the form of distribution. They corresponded exactly. The whole discussion, of course, was derailed by the primitive nature of the arguments of Bruno Ricci, Max Shachtman, and James Burnham. The only real argument against them is that they were unable to develop any theory whatsoever. They simply asserted that the USSR was a new mode of production with classes, but in no way did they try to understand the laws of motion of this new mode of production. For that reason, it was easy for Trotsky to show them up. Trotsky had at least some understanding of the society, whereas they only had a slogan. Today, it is obvious that if it were a mode of production, it ought to have lasted at least longer than 6 decades, which is not so much more, after all, than Salazar's regime in Portugal, and no one would call that a mode of production. Trotsky, however, took their arguments very seriously, specifically arguing that there was neither a new class in the USSR nor a new mode of production. Trotsky's arguments were in fact irrefutable in Marxist terms. A class must have a specific form of control over the surplus product, and Trotsky argued that the Soviet bureaucracy was too constrained to have developed a new method of pumping out surplus product. The privileges were hidden. The bureaucracy was forced to implement planning and hence to industrialize the economy. Industrialize the country. Planning. The major underpinning of Trotsky's analysis of the USSR was its planned nature, and indeed the whole debate hinges around the question of planning. But Trotsky and the bureaucratic collectivist argued that the bureaucracy planned the economy, but the latter argued that planning was possible in this new social formation. That argument, however, broke with Marxism, and that Marxists had argued effectively that planning was the antithesis of the market and was thus the basis of socialism. Trotsky himself remained convinced of that. Indeed, Trotsky argued that planning was only possible on the basis of democracy. Both sides of the debate were then locked into arguments which were incoherent. Had Trotsky completely abandoned the view that the USSR was planned, he would have been forced to conclude that the USSR was not a worker state, and that there was no contradiction between production and distribution. Indeed, at one point Trotsky did explicitly say as much, writing in 1933, quote, "The Soviet economy today is neither a monetary nor a planned economy. It is an almost purely bureaucratic economy," end quote. Trotsky thus embraced the contradiction in himself that the USSR was planned and yet was not planned, while not effectively recognizing that fact. I missed a footnote. Quote, the plan is only a working hypothesis. The fulfillment of the plan inevitably means its radical alteration by the masses whose vital interests are reflected in the plan, end quote. Trotsky, planned economy in the USSR, success or failure. End footnote. On the other hand, the other side of the debate produced a mechanical statement which was simply wrong in Marxist terms. Trotsky found it easier to make mincemeat of them. Their work was obviously not dialectical in that they did not try to perceive the contradictions operating in the society. Nonetheless, the underlying point that Shachtman and others were trying to make was that the USSR could not be understood as socialist or proto-socialist, towards which a workers' state viewpoint tended. Nationalization of the means of production could give rise to a form which was exploitative. The problem was not that Trotsky disagreed. Trotsky explicitly stated that a social revolution would be required in the USSR. Footnote. Quote, needless to say, the distribution of productive forces among the various branches of the economy and generally the entire content of the plan will be drastically changed when this plan is determined by the interest not of the bureaucracy, but of the producers themselves, ... Certain of our critics, Siliga, Bruno, and others, want, come what may, to call the future revolution social. Let us grant this definition. What does it alter in essence? End quote. It doesn't really seem like an explicit statement that a social revolution would be required in the USSR. It means simply, like I don't think that's it's kind of like an off. It seems like, at least in my opinion, that seems kind of like an offhand comment. Trotsky shifted from a standpoint of critical support that based itself on the view that it was a worker state and hence it had to be defended against imperialist attack, to an uncompromising hostility to all the institutions of the USSR. After all, if the USSR was exploitative, why did it have to be defended? It really is not clear unless one was to argue that nationalization in itself had to be defended. Today, with nationalization implemented by the most conservative of regimes, no one would argue for the defense of a country simply on those grounds. This would be superfluous as, after all, the simple argument that nations are entitled to their own destiny would suffice in order to argue for their defense. Indeed, Trotsky did argue in precisely this manner in 1940 when he said, quote, "When Italy attacked Ethiopia, I was fully on the side of Ethiopia, despite the Ethiopian negus, Negus, for whom I have no sympathy. What mattered was to oppose imperialism's seizure of this new territory. In the same way, now I decisively oppose the imperialist camp and support independence for the USSR, despite the negus in the Kremlin." End quote. Trotsky. While such a view is consistent with the defense of the USSR as a worker state, it actually renders otiose, O-T-I-O-S-E, those grounds for its defense. The question of exploitation or non-exploitation is a fundamental question. Trotsky rejected the view that, quote, "there was a system of exploitation in the scientific sense of the term," end quote. He spoke of, quote, "gangsterism," end quote, "embezzlement and theft," end quote, and said that it was embezzlement and theft which was the main source of the income of the bureaucracy. On the other hand, he found that, quote, "from the standpoint of the interest and position of the popular masses, it is infinitely worse than, quote, organic exploitation," end quote, end quote. The point that Trotsky was making was that the form of the extraction of surplus product was one in which there was no system. Hence, Trotsky spoke in the same paragraph of the, quote, "absence of crystallized class relations," end quote. This is what I have called a form of no form. The fact that the USSR lasted another half-century makes it difficult to speak of something worse than exploitation, which is not exploitation. "75 years of simple, quote, gangsterism," end quote, have to be explained. In other words, the very forms of which Trotsky was speaking could be said to have congealed to become a temporary system of its own kind. Trotsky was thinking of a mode of production rather than a temporary system, a concept which he did not entertain. It is clear that a mode of production did not evolve. It lasted too short a time, and this clear economic failure militates against that designation. In that sense, Trotsky was correct. Nonetheless, particular social relations did evolve, with particular relations between the ruling group and the workers. I have argued that we can continue his view along the following lines. We can say that the extraction of the surplus product by and for the, quote, bureaucracy, end quote, and its control of that surplus product was partially negated by the workers' continuing control over the labor process. The workers, however, did not control their product and hence were exploited. The notion of the workers continuing to control the labor process seems like a very dubious assertion, but maybe I'm wrong. The workers, however, did not control their product and hence were exploited. The fact that the USSR lasted another half-century makes it difficult to speak of the absence of a system of exploitation. According to Trotsky, the political economy of the USSR rested upon the question of planning and the ability to direct labor centrally. Put differently, he was arguing that the strength of the regime rested on its ability to plan the surplus product. Logically, when the control over the surplus product was removed, the regime would cease to have any historical justification and would cease to exist. Since Trotsky did not foresee the regime lasting that long, he could not develop such a political economy. Instead, he saw the contradiction as a development of Preobrazhensky's laws governing the relationship between the market and the plan, with the process being transformed into bourgeois norms of distribution. A capitalist state, and so a bourgeois bureaucracy, versus the continuation in the same form of the October Revolution. Thus he wrote as early as 1933, quote, "The Stalinist system is exhausted to the end and is doomed. Its breakup is approaching with the same inevitability with which the victory of fascism approached in Germany," end quote. He then argued that Stalinism was like a parasite which had wound itself around the tree of the October Revolution, although, quote, "the October Revolution will yet know how to fend for itself," end quote. Trotsky, The Degeneration Theory and the Theory of Degeneration. And footnote. Well, I guess I didn't say that was a footnote. I just said where the quote was from. If the laws governing the relationship between the market and the plan had been transformed in this manner, Trotsky was left with the question of the nature of the new laws that emerged from this transformation. What was the new political economy? Here Trotsky was left with merely a description of the abolition of the market in market terms. His fundamental error, which in one sense was very strange, was not to understand that the period of the form of no form could be the nature of the epoch itself. In the chapter In the Revolution Betrayed on the nature of inflation, Trotsky argued that the market was needed simply in order to have a measure of value and so a measure of costs. The argument, however, reflected a critique from the angle of the new economic policy and failed to understand the nature of the Soviet economy of the time. The point is that the Stalinist economy did indeed evolve into a non-market system, and it was the task of Marxists to analyze it. As we remark elsewhere, Trotsky's mistake was that he did not realize that Stalinism could last for so long, relatively speaking. It could be said that the mistake was understandable and that was only a mistake with hindsight. Nevertheless, Trotsky admitted that he had made a mistake when he had earlier argued that Thermidor had not occurred. Logically, he was on a trajectory of gradually admitting the reality of the formation of a system which remained undefined but was a system nonetheless. The nature of the system and its overthrow, the paradox of history. Trotsky discussed the possible overthrow of the Soviet Union and moved from a position in 1922 where he argued that capitalism would never win to a position where he said, quote, "A prolonged isolation would inevitably end not in national communism but in a restoration of capitalism," end quote. That statement, In the Revolution Betrayed, is then followed by a statement that the workers would fight for socialism. The clear implication is that restoration would not be easy, and it would, moreover, require a revolution to accomplish it. It would be easy to find many other quotations to show that Trotsky anticipated the move to capitalism but expected the working class to hinder it and possibly block it. Footnote. In the Revolution Betrayed itself, Trotsky declared, quote, "On the road to capitalism, the counter-revolution would have to break the resistance of the workers," end quote. End footnote. In this respect, Trotsky has been proved correct in anticipating that the Soviet elite would move to capitalism, something which he actually saw as being inherent in its nature. At the same time, he was more optimistic than such a prognosis might imply, because he expected strong working-class resistance. This was not a pragmatic point, since, as we have seen, Trotsky considered that the fact that capitalism was not restored under Stalin was partially due to the strength of the working class and the left opposition. He was compelled to argue that such opposition would continue to bar the way to capitalism. Events have provided a true historical paradox, looked at from the point of view of Trotsky's prognosis. The Soviet bureaucracy has chosen to move to capitalism and has abandoned the old Soviet Union, privatizing practically everything of importance by 1995. The left and the workers apparently stand nowhere. There is indeed no left opposition and no mass workers' opposition. On the other hand, the very reason that the Soviet ruling group abandoned the Soviet Union was its fear of the potential of the working class to remove it, and it went, as it were, for a preemptive strike. Trotsky had provided the tools for analyzing the end of the system. The crucial form of control held by the ruling group was that over labor. Once that began to go, the system was doomed. The flow of labor into production had ended by 1976. At that point, higher productivity rather than additional labor alone could raise production. The increase in the absolute surplus product had to be replaced by increases in the relative surplus product. The workers by that time were too strong and potentially too powerful to control. Hence, the ruling group took the only way out left for them. At the same time, the ruling group has not been able to introduce the market, and privatization is often only formal. It is indeed the working class which is blocking true privatization in the market. The ruling group, which is largely unchanged in the new non-Soviet order, is afraid to introduce mass unemployment and the necessary capitalist forms in case there is a social explosion. Inchoate, mute, and underground nonetheless, the working class continues to act. Trotsky was right, but in a way that he could never have foreseen. The subjective, Stalinism, had become objective. The subjective opposition had been totally wiped out. The world situation appeared to favor the capitalist road. A new movement had to be created. From the very beginning, with few internal cadres and under conditions where socialism looked utopian, even if desirable. The nature of the epoch. Trotsky could have taken an alternative and more logical path. The crucial concept was the epoch itself. Although the epoch had been initiated by the October Revolution and then altered by the Stalinist counter-revolution, it had become detached from its parent, the USSR. If one proceeds from this point, then one can argue that it is the world which is in transition, and that this transition is caused by the movement of the laws of capitalism and the decline of value itself. Thus Trotsky had this to say, quote, "The sharpness of the social crisis arises from this, that with today's concentration of the means of production, that is, the monopoly of trust, the law of value, the market is already incapable of regulating economic relations. State intervention becomes an absolute necessity," end quote. Trotsky, Bonapartism, Fascism, and War. In addition to the objective decline of capitalism, capitalism itself had been overthrown at least once in Russia. Whatever would happen to the USSR in the future, in a sense, could not alter the fact that capitalism had been overthrown. Thereby a conscious transition was placed on the agenda throughout the world, a transition, according to Trotsky, which had become prolonged because of social democracy. Of course, one would have to add that the prolongation of the transition gave rise to Stalinism, which in its turn delayed the onset of socialism still further. What was omitted from much of Trotskyist thinking was the fact that the bourgeoisie was also conscious of its own decline. It could and did take countermeasures to ensure that it remained in power, even if for a historically limited time. After all, if the individual capitalist retained his capital until his death, he at least had achieved something. Delay is today the essence of the epoch. The bourgeoisie took on board the lessons of the October Revolution. It realized that it would have to make concessions to the working class in order to stabilize the situation. Nationalization, growth, full employment, etc. have now become standard aims of reformist and Christian democratic governments. Even conservative governments have nationalized property and introduced forms of proto-planning, with France, Germany, and Japan being obvious examples. If the epoch itself now expresses the spirit of the October Revolution, only a complete reaction would return the world to what it was before the October Revolution. In this sense, the USSR is no longer important. Unless the working class the world over is prepared to return to mass unemployment and a low and static standard of living, no return is possible. In fact, such a return is unthinkable for other reasons as well. The socialization of the means of production has already enshrined the gains of the October Revolution. Thus, even the United States has maintained growth and relatively low unemployment levels in large part because the whole nature of the modern capitalist class is dependent upon it. Arms production is the centerpiece of modern industrial production, and it cannot be eliminated without enormous disruption to capital itself. It is also a needs-based industry funded by the state, and it is in fact organized and planned over a long period of time. Plan periods, predictability, and organization are now watchwords of modern industry, which would not exist if growth had not become a feature of modern capitalism. In other words, Trotsky did see the objective character of the epoch in terms of the decline of the law of value and the increased economic role of the state. But he did not foresee how far it could go, and that the bourgeoisie would use what instruments it could to retain power, even if they were the very tools required for the transition to socialism itself. It is strange that Trotsky did not argue this point. After all, the concept of the transitional epoch is his own. It is not a question of a general automatic movement, but a simple understanding of the laws of motion underlying not one country but the entire epoch. Yet, although this is a logical extension of his view, Trotsky did not get there. Trotsky continued to maintain the view that Stalin was a centrist. The consequence was that Stalinism became a subjective phenomenon rather than having its own political economy. Furthermore, it appeared to be a largely Russian rather than an epochal phenomenon. The process at work in the USSR. The market had really been abolished in the USSR. Furthermore, the concept of the conflict between the laws of the plan and of the market, of which Trotsky and Preobrazhensky had spoken, had admitted the actual result of such a conflict. Three results were possible: that the forces of the proletariat would win, that the forces of the market and thus the bourgeoisie would win, or there could be an interpenetration of the two laws themselves, resulting in a new form of society. In principle, either planning would defeat the market or the market would win, but if neither won, there would be neither one nor the other but degenerate forms of both, temporarily united in a society which had no historical form but which had an historical existence. At one level, Trotsky was actually struggling towards such a statement when he talked of the historical nature of the USSR being open. Footnote, quote, "But let us bear in mind that the unwinding process has not yet been completed, and the future of Europe and the world during the next few decades has not yet been decided," end quote. Trotsky in Stalin. End footnote. At another level, Trotsky was still bound to the previous history of the new economic policy, seeing the USSR in terms of the conflict between the plan and the market. Soviet theorists all argued in the early 1920s that primitive socialist accumulation was required in the USSR. Later, some identified the Stalinist process of industrialization with primitive socialist accumulation, while Trotsky hailed the industrialization of the USSR as a result of the elements of October. He did not call it primitive socialist accumulation. Indeed, any identification would have implied that the USSR was building socialism. When Trotsky criticized Preobrazhensky, he had referred to the possibility of using his analysis for purposes of building a national socialism. Hence, Stalin's industrialization could not be called primitive socialist accumulation. Indeed, its highly contradictory nature, gross inefficiency, and high levels of repression and killing were perhaps reminiscent of primitive capitalist accumulation. And yet it is not at all clear if there was an extraction of surplus product from the countryside. There was, of course, a shift of population from the countryside, although even that is called in question when the numbers killed in collectivization and who died in the famines are added up. After all, would there really have been a shortage of labor in the absence of collectivization? In that case, the process served no historical purpose at all except to maintain the elite in power. Trotsky saw the contradictions of the system and he opposed the forms of collectivization and so-called planning. But he still saw the system as showing the world the advantages of nationalization and planning. At that time, of course, no other country had utilized these instruments. What Trotsky did not fully analyze was the nature of the system coming into being. Logic, however, could have driven him into the position of arguing that the Soviet bureaucracy was not only unable to implement planning, but could not return to the market. So it would be driven from pillar to post in the quest to find an inherently impossible solution. Indeed, I would argue that this position is the only one consistent with his theoretical thought. Trotsky considered that the bureaucratized system had reached its limits. The bureaucracy constituted a brake on the, quote, demands of the development, end quote. The demands of development, end quote. For a time, it was possible to develop, but already by the late 1930s, it could no longer do so. Hence the, quote, political convulsions, end quote, and the purges. Trotsky therefore theorized the contradictions of the system, but he did so in an absolutist way, really failing to say more than that the forces of production were coming into conflict with the relations of production. That was true, but it remained so thereafter. What was missing was an explanation of the forms in which the conflict was taking place. The question of the market versus planning. Trotsky argued very strongly in favor of the restoration of the market. This has misled Alec Nove and Richard Day into thinking that Trotsky was arguing for the market under socialism. This is simply nonsense. Trotsky was arguing quite clearly that there would have to be a market in a transitional period between capitalism and socialism. Nonetheless, the market is the enemy of socialism. Thus, quote, the ruble will become the most stable valuta only from that moment when the Soviet productivity of labor exceeds that of the rest of the world and when, consequently, the ruble itself will be meditating on its final hour, end quote. Trotsky, the revolution betrayed. And again, Trotsky basically repeated Marx when he said, quote, In a communist society, the state and money will disappear. Their gradual dying away ought consequently to begin under socialism. We shall be able to speak of the actual triumph of socialism only at that historical moment when the state turns into a semi-state and money begins to lose its magic power. End quote. I have a couple things on my channel. Some of I don't know if they're up quite yet, but at least the two main ones are a piece by one is titled "The Myth of the Transitional Period," or the Transitional Society, I believe it's actually called, by Adam Buick, and the other would be titled I think it's called "The Economic Content of Socialism: Marx versus Lenin," by Paresh Chattopadhyay. But then Trotsky goes on to say, quote, "Money cannot be arbitrarily, quote, abolished," end quote, "nor the state and old family, quote, liquidated," end quote. They have to exhaust their historical mission, evaporate and fall away, end quote. Of course, Trotsky was not likely to say anything else if he were a Marxist, since the contradiction between exchange value and use value is the basis of all Marxist political economy. It has only been the reformist Stalinists and social democrats who have ever argued anything else. It is pointless to take this part of Trotsky's argument further at this point because it is the ABC of Marxism. But what is more interesting is to look at what Trotsky was actually saying about the withering away of money in the market. He appears to be saying that money in the market must continue to be used until the demise of the transition period to socialism. They have to wither gradually. The terminology is not important since it is apparent that Trotsky has adopted not Marx's terminology but that of the Soviet Republic. How can they be used by the proletariat? Trotsky does not really address this question. He had done so earlier in his, quote, "scissors," end quote, speech, when he pointed out that there is an irreconcilable conflict between the market and planning. Footnote. Trotsky's speech at the 12th Party Congress on the scissors crisis described the NEP as follows, quote, "The NEP is our recognition of a legal order for the arena of struggle between us and private capital," end quote. Earlier, Trotsky made it clear that the market was essential for all countries undergoing a transition to socialism. At the same time, he made it crystal clear that it was the use of, quote, "methods and institutions of the capitalist system," end quote, which will be phased out quickly as the new socialist methods of planning, centralization, and accounting could be introduced. End footnote. Get some water real quick. There are really two problems. The first is how the proletariat can use the market under the best conditions of the transitional period, and the second is the same question but under the worst conditions, as it were. The latter was the case in the USSR, where the country stood alone in the capitalist world and the economy was both backward and in ruins. At the same time, the proletariat was a tiny proportion of the population. In the first case, the proletariat could be assumed to be strong enough to deal with the problems which would arise out of a market economy. It would begin to phase out the market from the first day of taking power, even if it took some time completely to extinguish it. In the case of the USSR, however, the domestic market would inevitably be linked to international capitalism and would therefore constitute a political enemy. Furthermore, the small size of the proletariat would make it easy for the growing market sector to displace the proletariat from power. This would be the political problem, which indeed Trotsky had pointed out much earlier in his Scissors speech. There was also an economic problem which would be ameliorated in the case of an advanced country that was part of a wider socialist fraternity of nations by two factors: a high and rising standard of living and a high level of democracy. The problem would be ameliorated but not removed. The economic problem is that the two sectors do not complement each other, but undermine each other. This was the essence of Preobrazhensky's argument, and again it is essentially a logical development of the contradiction between exchange value and use value into the transitional period. The basis of the market sector has to be exchange on the basis of value, which is precisely what Trotsky insisted was needed for planning in the USSR. But the basis of value is abstract labor, whereas the basis of planning is democratic participation in decision-making by associated producers themselves. Abstract labor and democratic participation by labor cannot coexist. In the first case, we are talking of the alienated controlled worker, whereas in the second, we are talking of the free worker who will be increasingly engaged in creative labor and whose interests as a human being take priority over production. Thus, from the point of view of value, women's labor must be reduced or paid less because they have to take time off to have children. From the point of view of the planned society, however, women's interests are primary, with production itself coming secondary. It is true that in the long run, women's labor will be much more productive under planning than under the forms of oppression in capitalism. But in the transitional period, this would take some time to show itself. Again, for instance, mining is an inhuman form of labor, and the planned sector would have to automate it to the maximum degree or phase mining out. On the other hand, the market sector might find it highly profitable to use cheap peasant labor. The proletariat would have to remove crucial aspects of the law of value on taking power. It would have to eliminate unemployment and thus eliminate the reserve army of labor. It would have to introduce a minimum wage and standard of living. Under these conditions, the workers in the market sector would have less incentive to work hard, and since they either could not be dismissed or would easily find another job. Quality of Soviet goods did indeed drop in all sectors in the post-revolutionary period, as compared with the same firms under Tsarism. Preobrazhensky's plaintive cry that the Soviet regime had neither the advantages of capitalism nor of socialism would be an inevitable concomitant of any transitional period. To make matters worse, the kind of problem now being faced by cooperatives in the USSR is also inevitable. Where do supplies come from for the different sectors? They cannot, of course, be self-sufficient. If the market sector needed machinery from the planned sector, it would have to conform to the planned form. That is, it would have to place its orders with the central planners, in accordance with the needs of the planned economy. Under conditions of shortage, the planned sector could not have sufficient goods to leave it to wholesale trade, and so to spontaneity, as it were. On the other hand, the planned sector could not simply place enormous orders with the market sector at random. There would have to be planned cooperation. The market sector would then chafe at the difficulty in obtaining supplies and with selling to the state sector. The state sector would find in its turn that the market sector would charge it whatever it could get. If the market firm was a monopoly, it could overcharge the planned sector, while if there were competition, the monopoly of the state sector would permit it to squeeze the market sector. Then, too, the whole question of pay would be enough to lead to a revolution. The private sector would be based on profits, and so the managerial staff would be very well off, while the planned sector would be based on need, so that pay would be planned as the maximum possible after meeting the needs of further investment. Managers in the planned sector would be less well paid than in the private sector. The result would be an increasing animosity between workers and the private sector managers, supervisors, skilled workers, etc. Indeed, the workers of the private sector would be bound to strike for higher pay, better conditions, and more democratic participation in management. How could they be denied them? There is no ready solution to these problems. They are inevitable, and were bound to be much worse in the conditions of the early USSR. In a developed society, the market sector would be quickly reduced in size and scope, but in a backward society, this would not be possible. The point is that Trotsky faced these problems, which were indeed raised in the 1920s, but he saw them only in the most general class form. Rather, at one point, he saw Stalinism as being the expression of the bureaucratic apparatus which found itself in conflict with the growing petite bourgeoisie of the 1920s. Stalinism then had to turn against its allies, the petite bourgeoisie. Footnote, quote, in the manner of the national surplus product, the bureaucracy and the petite bourgeoisie quickly changed from alliance to enmity, end quote. From this perspective, end footnote, from this perspective, it would be clear that socialism in one country is a complete nonsense. But what also follows is that Stalinism did not turn against money and market by accident. The NEP could not possibly have lasted very long. It could only have been a holding operation. Logically, once that holding operation failed, some result had to eventuate. That result was Stalinism. The Stalinist economy resulted, therefore, from the failure to introduce the planned economy. But the planned economy could not exist with a market economy under the conditions of the USSR. On the other hand, the market economy demanded the abolition of forms of urban organization which had come into existence. Conclusion. Trotsky's analysis failed to foresee that the Stalinist economy could last for some time, although it was not a mode of production and did not have classes. Nonetheless, it is possible to understand Stalinism using Trotsky's method and initial starting point. From this viewpoint, a Stalinist regime is necessarily both non-market and non-socialist. No reforms are possible. It must either disintegrate and be overthrown, or return to capitalism. The USSR had a limited life that was based on the expansion of absolute surplus product, and the USSR exhausted it. This chapter has argued that Trotsky's political economy of the USSR was in process of formation. He provided a logical analysis which could be drawn out to provide a fuller political economy of Stalinism. At the same time, he himself could not do so, and his own views were less of a theory than a series of observations and insights. The crucial concept is that of the nature of labor, and following from that, the control of surplus labor. Trotsky's thought evolved over the period of 1929 to 40, but it is also internally inconsistent. This chapter has argued that Trotsky totally opposed the market, but argued for its retention and gradual phasing out in the transition period. Trotsky's view of Stalinism as an economic entity was unformed. On the one hand, he saw it as a parasite, while on the other he viewed it as a socio-economic entity. He remained true to the end to the idea that Stalinism was centrist, and hence there remained some aspect of the gains of October. On the other hand, his argument of 1940 for the defense of the USSR no longer relied on that point. Trotsky's crucial concept was not that of a worker state, but of the transition period. Logically, he could have argued that the transition period had incorporated the effects of the October Revolution in an irrevocable way.